Cynthia. You must be here for the readings. Well, let's get started. Okay, so this one is called Decolonizing Imperialism in Education by Marie Battiste and Youngblood Henderson. So, and it's basically about education and how we come to accept ways of knowing as truth. The author makes the point that under cognitive imperialism, modern educational theory and practice has in large part destroyed or distorted Indigenous knowledge and heritage. So it's saying that basically we need to dismantle cognitive imperialism in education because it's harmful to Indigenous people, and it's an inaccurate way of knowing and being that relies on a categorical view of the world. I'm just going to back this up a bit because it's kind of messing with me there. There, that's better. Now you can kind of see a little bit more. So, cognitive imperialism is a type of thought manipulation or control over a people that denies them their language and cultural integrity by maintaining legitimacy of only one language, one culture, and one frame of reference. So the author goes on to say that Eurocentric public schooling has not been benign in this process. It's been used as a means to perpetuate damaging myths about Indigenous knowledge and heritage, languages, beliefs, and way of life. So it's being used as a tool of colonialism, essentially. And the author says that this quest to limit thought or assimilate thought denies Indigenous people access to and participation in the formulation of the educational policy, constrains the use and development of knowledge and heritage in schools, and confines education to a narrow, positivistic, scientific view of the world that threatens the global future. I actually thought that would be a good thesis, but I think the thesis is more of like an educational one. So I'm just going to get this prepared here as well. Okay, so we've established that there is a problem. We know that Eurocentrism is also established Eurocentric science as the dominant mode of thought, and that's going to be a problematic thing for Indigenous people. The author says there's two different points of issue. The first is the right of Indigenous people to exercise and transmit knowledge and heritage. The other is the benefit of the Western world from Indigenous knowledge. So not only is it important that Indigenous knowledge and heritage is preserved and enhanced, but it's also important that they're recognized as a dominant as the domain of Indigenous people, and not subverted by the dominant culture. It continues on to say that although cognitive imperialism devalues Indigenous knowledge, it will take elements of that knowledge out of context and claim it for itself. So it's sort of saying, listen, there's a lot you could learn from this way of knowing. Obviously, if you take it, you're establishing on some basis that it's true. So from here the article becomes somewhat explanatory regarding different ways of knowing, which is actually necessary for a reader that has no knowledge about Indigenous ways of knowing to understand the context of the rest of this article. Specifically why Eurocentric ways of knowing is basically a polar opposite way of knowing for Indigenous people. So if you consider that fact, it's actually oppressive to Indigenous ways of knowing as a system. One way Eurocentric knowledge is transferred is its educational system. And Euro curricula is built on 4 errors. And those are faulty generalization, circular reasoning, mystified concepts, and partial knowledge. And there's more definitions, like further explanations of that in the reading. But it creates a sort of method of thinking within differences accepted by the dominant, in this case the colonizer's way of knowing. So the strategy of difference is also like another artificial system. that when deconstructed always leads to a similar and usually non-threatening outcome. It's categorical. It's not concerned with creating communities, but creating specialized interests among students that basically feeds back into the system. There's no sense of responsibility in this knowledge manipulation. It claims a sense of objectivity, but the strategy of difference is subjective in its way of knowing. It only works if everyone buys into the system, which everyone does, because generally everyone thinks you need education to be productive in society. But it's not useful for Indigenous people and harms their way of being. Okay. I've got a lot out there. That's a lot of talking. So, I'm just going to rip off another little piece here to send this through. Oh boy, that's a dirty back end. Let's see if we can clean that out a bit. Okay, so goes on to talk about decolonizing the system, and it says enhancement is a concept here where you accrue rather than replace knowledge. And cognitive imperialism basically has to be dismantled in all aspects of public education. This could be the thesis, actually, because it's very harmful to Indigenous knowledge. So it says that this type of knowing is holistic and it has to be preserved. So this means modified teaching in an enhanced educational curriculum for Indigenous students. It's important to note that the article says they don't need to invent a new way of transmitting Indigenous knowledge. They just have to develop concepts that reflect traditional education transmission process. Just gonna put that right there. Okay, I'll stick that over the top, like so. Okay, so when it says understand methods, support training centers that are controlled by Indigenous elders and educators. So I actually really like that part of the article because I think that we should also have access to elders. And I was actually pretty surprised when I came to university and found out there was actually so little for Indigenous students. I think they should have mandatory elder access from all universities, should have to have that. Overall, and although I found this article a little messy to get through, I understood the concept and the importance of dismantling Eurocentric thought in the educational system. But I don't think it'll happen. I see it as a central part of a larger issue in Eurocentrism, which would possibly involve a total overhaul of the current structure. I think Indigenous methods of knowing can be employed individually, but not as a whole under our current system. Considering it is so entrenched into our ways of being now and accepted in our institutions, I think it would involve a complete dismantling of our current system, which would be near impossible. I think it would take change at the highest levels of government to include Indigenous ways of being, thought, and knowing, which isn't really an Indigenous way of knowing. So it could involve a change that no one would even expect or understand at all. Another consideration is the fact that land is so intricately tied with ways of being in Indigenous cultures. I don't think Eurocentrism in its fragmented divide and conquer form is prepared to cede land, and that would be in direct conflict with in any educational setting. But at the same time, this is a personal viewpoint, and I think that it's important to note that even employed individually, it has a power to transform. I think it's important to challenge these things we accept and further consider that the future holds many possibilities. And I think that is an important point, because even at a fractional level, it's important to keep hope that younger people can enact real change. That's not a bad print. needs to be a little deeper, I think, over here. But anyway, that's my first article. And thanks for watching my print process.